to the Make a Mental Note podcast, where mental health professionals share information and perspectives that illuminate, educate, and is worthy of a mental note. And now your host, Chris Quarto.
Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto, and welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. Thanks for joining me. My mental health tip for this week has to do with changing elements of your personal story. If you think back to your story, the story of your life, there have been a lot of people that have impacted you, some in good ways, some in not so good ways, whether it's parents, family members, friends. But all of those experiences combine to make you who you are today. But it doesn't necessarily have to define who you are if you don't want it to. Michael Hyatt says, "We have more control than most of us realize. Each day is filled with thousands of opportunities to change the story of our lives." I think of a person who grew up with a critical parent who, whatever they did, it just was never good enough. And so as an adult, in perhaps a job, they might be doing things, just a fantastic job, but yet that inner critic kind of sneaks in and creeps in and says, it's not good enough. You could do better than that. Well, my challenge for you this week is to make a conscious choice to redefine this element of your personal story. And so if you have this tendency to be critical, let's say, to make a choice to say, no, I'm not going to buy into that this week. This week, if I do a good job, I'm going to tell myself it's a good job and allow myself to feel good about that, and not to think that I have to continue to do things to make it better, knowing that I'll never get to the point that it's better. So whatever that element is from your personal life story that continues to hound you, see if you can do something this week to tweak it, kind of like what I was talking about, and not allow that to continue to define you in ways that you don't want it to be defined. You're the one who creates your story. What's that part of you, of your story, that you can change or tweak this week to make a difference, to make your story better as you move on in life? That's my challenge for you. Okay, my guest on this week's episode of the Make a Mental Note podcast is Zemeira Singer, who's a narrative therapist in California. She's actually going to be talking about the importance of stories in clients' lives. So without further ado, here's Zemeira. Hi, everyone. This is Chris Quarto. Welcome again to the Make a Mental Note podcast. I'm joined today by Zemeira Singer, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist in the California area. And Zemeira, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here.
Well, I'm glad to have you. Well, if you wouldn't mind, just tell the mental note-taking audience a little bit about who you are, what you do for a living.
Okay, I'm a marriage and family therapist.
All right.
I practice currently in private practice in the Berkeley, Oakland area, San Francisco Bay area at large.
Alrighty.
And I work with, I've worked with every age group from 5-year-olds up to 65-year-olds.
Oh, wow.
Currently in my practice, I mostly see adults and teenagers.
Uh-huh.
I also do parent consultation, and I have done child play therapy and family therapy.
Wonderful.
And then some supervision of interns and trainees in graduate psychology or social work programs.
Very cool. That must be quite a challenge to work with a 5-year-old all the way up to 65. I imagine you have to really be flexible to be able to do that.
To some degree, but I mean, I really like people and I really sort of enjoy meeting my clients where they're at. So it's nice to have a range of different folks to work with and different types of, problems or issues that people are struggling with.
Yeah, you get the variety by doing it that way.
Yeah.
That's neat. Well, one of the things that I always like to ask my guests is I like to find out about their stories, especially, how is it that you decided to go into the helping profession? So what's your story, Zemeira?
I actually have a pretty good one, which is, the short version is essentially that in my early 20s, I was trained in theater and was living in New York, practicing like kind of avant-garde theater and also bartending to make a living.
Yes.
And I started noticing as a bartender that, people would come in, and while they maybe were coming in to socialize or have a drink or whatever, a lot of times they really just wanted somebody to listen to them. And so a friend of mine and I were sort of like noticing this phenomenon. She was also a bartender, and we decided to write a series of monologues kind of that were a bit of a pastiche of our clients, or our patrons' stories.
Okay.
And that led me to just realizing that I was incredibly interested in people's stories. And, on the road of deciding to go back to graduate school and pursue a degree in psychology.
Wow, so that's how it happened. That's a very interesting story. So I bet as a bartender, you heard some really good stories, didn't you?
Yeah, and a lot of hard stories, too. I mean, one thing that is, probably particular to all bars, but particularly many bars in New York, is that people use them kind of as their living room, and it's sort of a social space. And what I found was that particularly with people who were, say, like a regular in a bar where they were coming in at a certain time to have a drink, like, every day or every week, that a lot of the folks were actually, struggling with probably, different versions of alcoholism, but more than that, had lived through some pretty hard things in their life. They had trauma, essentially. I didn't have the language for that at the time to know that they were talking about trauma. But, I did notice that I had this one kind of incident with a regular of mine who I really liked. He was a really sweet guy. And, he came in and he was telling me this story, and I don't even remember what the story was about, but it was some aspect of his life that, wasn't working. And he was, telling me this story, and I was listening and offering, advice. And at a certain point, I realized that he had told me the same story probably every day, that he'd come in for, maybe 3-4 months.
Right.
And I realized that while, I thought I was being helpful by listening and offering advice. And here I was offering the same advice that I'd probably offered him the day before.
Sure.
And I realized that while he was talking to me, what he was really interested in was, the bottle that was sitting on the shelf behind me. And that was a big aha for me, because I had kind of thought that I was being helpful to people in some way. And then I realized, like, oh, wow, if you really want to help people, you need to put yourself in a place where they actually really are ready for help, that they want help.
Sure.
Rather than, they're kind of just spinning a tape, and they want to be listened to, but they're not actually moving towards change.
Right.
And so, that was kind of when I made this decision to sort of leave my pursuit of the arts and pursue a degree in psychology.
Interesting. Well, I invited you on the podcast today, Zemeira, because I know that you have some expertise in an area of therapy called narrative therapy. And if you wouldn't mind, because some of the audience, the mental note takers, might not really be familiar with this. I know I'm not. So if you wouldn't mind, if you could just say a little bit about that, and then I'm going to ask you some questions about it.
Absolutely. And I'll say kind of it's hard to sum up in a, short period. So I'll leave it to you to, edit out what doesn't fit.
Sure.
So essentially, narrative therapy was developed by two family therapists in starting in the 70s and 80s. They were essentially looking at post-structuralist and postmodern philosophy theories and applying that to family therapy and just therapy in general. Part of the reason for that was it was really a departure from the medical model, which, grew out of psychoanalytic theory, and particularly the idea that when people come into therapy, they view their problems as internal and specific to them, and particularly, that they receive diagnosis and that the therapist or, prior to therapists, they were analysts, and there still are some analysts today, that the analyst could know, more about their unconscious and internal drives than they did. So this was a real departure because they were seeing people come in who, really believed that there was something deeply wrong with them. And, suggested that part of a different way of working was to particularly look at the client's language and to address that there is a power relationship in the therapeutic relationship.
Okay.
So that was pretty revolutionary at the time. Narrative is the only therapy that sees itself as being political and sees itself as being sort of at its roots, rooted in social justice, rooted in a real respect for the client and for the therapist, an acknowledgement that our role has an effect on people. We can actually potentially help people to make things better, or we can actually make things worse. In this day and age, you have plenty of people who actually, who, if they've been to therapy, they've been in and out of therapy, they've probably had some experiences in therapy that were fantastic.
Yes.
And they probably had some experiences that were terrible. And so, narrative therapy essentially really looked at the stance of the therapist and a decentering of power, saying we're going to share power, and we're going to let the client lead rather than the therapist sort of diagnosing and deciding that somebody has, a disorder or I don't really know the language.
Well, it's really a departure.
Psychoanalysis.
It's a departure from the medical model, isn't it? I mean, because up to that point in time, that was really a dominant force. I mean, through the 60s and even into the 70s, it was still a dominant force. But from what I hear you saying, that probably some of the changes that were taking place in the late 60s, early 70s, that probably corresponded to the development of this approach, where why is it that the therapist has to have all the power? Why can't we have maybe more of a shared type of power, maybe more of a partnership or collaboration? Maybe that's a better way of conceptualizing that. Yeah. So, I mean, there's certain things that, interestingly are now kind of common practice amongst lay people that really came from narrative therapy, but people don't realize that. I mean, particularly the idea of collaboration, particularly the idea of transparency, that I'm not going to sit back and have some secret agenda for what I think a client needs and do that under wraps, but I'm going to actually tell them, well, here's what I'm thinking right now. This is what I see, or a lot of, reflective listening really came out of that. And then particularly the idea of externalization, which I think is the one thing that really helps narrative to, stand apart, which is
this idea that, if somebody is coming in with a problem, say they have depression, for instance, that we can look at the depression as a disorder, medical model,
right.
that just like you would have a flu.
Right.
Or you can look at the depression, it's actually a force or an interaction of a lot of things, and that by externalizing it, saying, we ask these really weird questions like, how has, depression been getting in the way of your relationships, right? By asking it like that, the person can then stop feeling a sense of shame about it and talk about this problem as if it doesn't belong to them, which, leads them to thinking, hey, well, if it doesn't belong to me, it can come and go, and I may have an effect on how it operates.
I see. So it's almost like you're trying to make something like depression or anxiety an entity of sorts that's separate from the client, so the client doesn't feel it's part of them, and perhaps doesn't have that degree of power or control over them as they once thought it did.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is particularly effective. I mean, with kids, it's great because kids just kind of think about things that way anyway, and you can actually do all kinds of cool stuff like give it a character, I have them pick out a puppet that, or a toy that represents it, and then we'll, talk about it, make up a story about it, figure out how they can use their superpowers to, overcome it. And kids will just sort of go for it.
Well, and you get your creativity fix, don't you, by doing that?
Yeah. It's very fun. It's very playful, and also, it's particularly helpful for folks who have experiences of being, marginalized in larger societies. Sure. So particularly, we also, are very interested in culture and cultural context. And so, particularly for folks who are part of the LGBT community, or people of color, or anyone who's, people who've been immigrants who are transitioning into a new society that feels like theirs. It's been particularly helpful with having other ways of talking about it, because it also acknowledges that psychotherapy as a practice came out of a certain culture and has certain beliefs and, discourses and all of that, may actually be unhelpful to a person's, sense of who they are or how they move through the world.
That's interesting. Well, let me ask you a very basic question, Zemeira, because the title of this approach, it's called narrative therapy. So where does that word narrative come from, and how this approach is used? I mean, what does that mean as it's applied to this approach?
So that's a good question, and I think, I can kind of speak to it, though other narrative therapists might be more knowledgeable about this than me. I do know that the form of therapy was developed, and then at a certain point they gave a name to it because, once you're doing something, you have to give it a title.
Yeah, so what are we going to call this anyway?
But particularly, one of the threads through narrative therapy is this idea about story development and how somebody might, that when people are experiencing problems, they usually have a problem story. It goes something like, oh, well, ever since I was a kid, this thing has been happening to me, and, I've had all these experiences, that justified that, and, it becomes very true.
Yes.
And they were, some of them, David Epston, actually, in particular, who's one of the founders, particularly was looking at literature, right? And looking at, different kinds of story development, right? And could you, if you were encountered with somebody's very deeply entrenched problem story, could you help them craft an alternate story? Maybe a story of bravery, a story of success in the face of great difficulty.
Right.
You know, that this idea that humans are faced with challenges and overcome them, and sometimes the ways that we overcome them might not be, you know, what's considered socially appropriate at that time, but that they actually make sense on some level. So there's a lot of, you know, kind of focus on restorying something, looking for what we call unique outcomes. You know, well, even though you got really upset and yelled, which is something that you don't like to do, what were you resisting against? You know, what was happening for you when that occurred? And were you maybe protesting against somebody calling you, you know, crazy or something like that? You know, particularly this has been more helpful with, you know, folks who have maybe severe mental illness or who have been in and out of systems, you know, like in psychiatric wards, or, you know, where they worked a lot with people with anorexia or things that were very medicalized, to try and have a better understanding of what the person was after. So, you know, and by creating this like alternate story and even using, you know, more playful language about it, creating these characters, it helps the person to like have a different understanding of themselves.
So
positive.
Part of this, I guess, is first of all, just kind of understanding the client's story, to have them share their story, how they kind of view this, and then perhaps engage with them in ways of perhaps altering the story or altering elements of it. And I guess I'm kind of curious about that, because, you know, there's this notion of, you know, resistance and psychotherapy and all this kind of stuff. And I wonder if you ever encounter that, Zemeira, when you talk to clients about, you know, tweaking or changing elements of the story, if you ever get clients who are kind of resistant to do that. And if so, where's that resistance coming from?
Well, so as a narrative therapist, we don't believe in the concept of resistance being something that's internal. So we would think that, you know, what looks like resistance is actually a fairly entrenched problem.
All right.
That when we encounter what is traditionally considered resistance, that means that the problem's actually getting nervous. You know, because as a person starts to view their world differently, the problem's going to hang on for dear life, because it really, you know, it wants to stay with that person. It wants to stick around. And so, you know, I would be curious about their response, right? If somebody is really not, I guess, like, responding to, like, if I'm trying to restory something, like, well, you know, let's look at it like this, kind of similar to a positive reframe. And somebody goes, no, you know, you don't get it. That's a big clue for me as a therapist, that I need to slow down, and that the client doesn't feel that I have a good understanding of where they're coming from. So it's just a place for me to, like, get more curious, rather than a place where in, you know, psychodynamic therapy, people can get into power struggles with their therapist, right? The therapist really sees something a certain way, and they really wants the client to get it. And those are the situations where, well, sometimes those things can get worked through, but from my understanding, more often than not, that's when clients don't come back.
Yes.
They say, I'm out of here. You don't get me.
Well, this sounds a little bit like the solution-focused approach, which also doesn't really. There's not this belief in the whole concept of resistance, and if resistance does happen, it's not because of the client. It's because the therapist is not asking. The therapist isn't doing something, and so it means you need to do something different. So it sounds very similar from that respect. So
and those two schools actually grew out of the same sort of working groups of people. There's a lot of similarities between solution-focused and narrative, both that they're postmodern therapies. So.
Well, what was interesting, what you just said, is that if something like this happens, what you said is that the problem is trying to hang on. So once again, it's that entity separate from the client. And do you ever have clients who, I guess it's sort of the same question, Zemeira, that I was just talking about with resistance. I wonder if what clients' reactions are when you first try to take that approach of separating them from the problem. I mean, what kind of responses do you get from clients when you initially introduce that concept?
I mean, some people really are responsive to it. They get excited.
Yeah.
I mean, one client of mine, I recall, said, gosh, that just gives me such a sense of freedom to think that the anxiety is separate from me.
Yeah.
It's not who I am, and because I have low self-esteem, So there's kind of a bit of a surprise because it is so different from how they're thinking about it. Some clients are less responsive to like the externalization, which I don't always use it. It really depends on the person and what's working for them. Sometimes people find the languaging of it a little bit weird, or if they tend to be more of like, a little bit more serious or a little bit more scientifically minded, they might kind of like go like, okay, I'll go along with this, but not, it's not really my thing.
Yeah, it's not an easy buy-in for them.
yeah. And so that's just a clue to me that like maybe that approach might not be as helpful for them, or that we haven't gotten there yet. They don't trust me enough for me to do something too weird, Or it might also be like a clue that, rather than it being a clue, it still informs how I'm thinking about the content that people are bringing into the room. That like if they're sort of, I can still think of the problem as external to them and maybe be speaking to the part of them that's not as colonized by the problem. Even if I'm not doing anything different with my language or pushing the externalization as the way that we're talking about it in the room.
It's interesting because you could almost, by doing this, using this approach, it's almost as if you have three people in the therapy room, or three, components, or you, the client, and the problem. And do you ever carry on conversations with the problem in front of the client? Have you ever done that?
Absolutely. Well, there's a few different practices that particularly I found this very effective with teenagers.
Okay.
They really love this one usually, which is that, we'll kind of get a definition or a name for the problem. Say we've been talking about anxiety. So let's say we have anxiety, and then I'll actually ask them. I'm forgetting there's actually a name for this technique, and my fellow narrative therapists will get me in trouble for not remembering the name. But where I'm interviewing the problem. And so I asked them to become the problem, kind of like there's a little bit of theatrics there, you know. I asked them to visualize themselves like a physical form that's different from them, you know, and ask permission to interview the problem and ask the problem questions about, you know, its effect on, you know, this person's life.
Right.
So if the client was Jane, you know, so, you know, how long have you and Jane known each other? You know, and the really interesting things will come out, you know. Clients will kind of like actually identify that like this problem has been with them in a small way since second grade, you know. And so that's one thing, that one way of sort of bringing the problem into the room is separate from the client, and then, you know, we'll ask it to leave, so they get to become themselves. They get, you know, thank you very much for your time, just like you'll do at the end of this interview with me, right? And we really enjoyed speaking with you. Can I talk to Jane again? You know, and then I'll ask Jane to, what was that like for you? And well, I didn't. And usually what happens is people will realize something about how the problem is operating that they didn't know. So, like, I didn't realize that the problem shows up when I'm, you know, in social situations at school, or I hadn't really put that together, that the problem is, you know, having this much of an effect on my life. You know, they'll have some sort of insight about it.
It's an experiential technique, and it's almost as if you're talking to somebody with multiple personality disorder. You know, can I talk to this other personality? And in a sense, it has psychodrama elements to that approach as well.
Yeah, I mean, there's ways that it's like similar to parts work and Gestalt, or, you know, we have to remember that all of these different ways of working built on top of each other over time. You know? So
exactly,
there's a lot of cross-pollination.
Well, looking at the clients that you've worked with, Zemeira, and I like to talk to my guests about their recipes for success. And, you know, you have clients who come in with their issues to see you, and you're using this approach with them. What is your recipe for success in getting them to move from point A, where they have these problems, to point B, where they're actually doing really well and don't need to see you anymore? Are there any things in particular that you do to kind of help them move from point A to point B?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. A big part of it is how you set things up in the beginning. That's super important for me. And it's I think absolutely with every kind of therapy, the most important thing is trust. You know, if a client doesn't feel like you get what they're struggling with, they're going to be far less likely to, you know, take in your suggestions, or collaborate with you on it, because they're going to spend a lot of time either trying to convince you or sort of writing you off, which is what, you know, going back to resistance. Resistance can show up that way, right? So in the beginning of therapy, I'm very transparent with my clients about how I work. I make sure they know that they can always ask me questions, that they can always disagree with me, that I might make mistakes and get things wrong, and that I really want them to correct me if I've made a false assumption or misunderstood something they've shared. And then from there, it's a bit like making a map of where they want to get to. So another thing, you know, you mentioned is point A to point B. So getting clear on what point B is for them in the beginning, having them articulate in some way what would be the circumstances that you would, you know, things were better and you wouldn't feel like you wanted to come see me anymore, even if we enjoyed each other's company and all that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So, and that gets people thinking about their goals and what they want. So once I've kind of been transparent with them and shared how I work and all of that, and got some sort of picture of like what their version of success is.
Yeah.
Then we're kind of filling in the in-between, and I'm always sort of holding in my mind where they want to get to, and also asking if, has that goal changed?
I see.
Some people come into therapy because they just, they just want some aspect of their life to be better.
Right.
And then they figure out that things are a lot more complicated, and there are things that they thought were fine that they actually want to change. So it's kind of this ongoing process of adjusting. But I don't think that there's any formula that works for everyone.
Yeah.
I think it's always this dynamic process, because every conversation that I have with a client is going to be really different, because they're different and I'm different in response,
Yes. But the thing that you do that's consistent is what you had talked about earlier in terms of really this whole approach being different from the medical model approach, is where you from the get-go establish that there is no power differential, or at least you attempt to do that by saying things like, you tell me if I'm wrong, or you tell me what you need. And you're trying to make that very clear to them that you're trying to work with them collaboratively. And I think the other thing that it sounded like you're trying to do too, Zemeira, is establishing from the get-go that there's trust, that you can be trusted, that you're going to be open and honest. Really, you're talking about some of the very basic elements that Carl Rogers talked about many years ago in terms of some of those essential elements for good psychotherapy. And here it is that you're doing that to establish the relationship. And what I hear you saying is that that's very important for the work that's going to follow, as well as getting them to give you a picture of what point B looks like, and for you to be able to check in with them throughout the course of therapy to make sure that they're getting toward that, or if they want to change, they can do that, because once again, they have the power, they have the control to do that if they make that choice.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right. Yeah.
Well,
and what I've found, honestly, is like, since being in private practice, is that for the most part, and this might sound arrogant, but I want to be clear that it's really not, is like when I have a consult with somebody, when they call me, it starts there.
Okay.
The transparency starts there. And I can pretty much, be certain that like most of the people who are ready to start therapy, who make it in, who call me and they're like actually ready, they're not just feeling it out, that they will come in for a first session, and that from the first session, it's really likely that they will continue. Now, how long they continue depends on them and what's going on, but I've had very few of those situations that therapists often have where, you get a lot of people who come in once and or twice and then bail. And I honestly think that that's partially just about like being really transparent with them at the beginning, and that allows them to kind of like relax a little bit.
Yeah.
It's been surprising to me, honestly, because I figured I'd have more of those experiences, because most therapists do.
Well, it starts with the first contact, is what you're saying. Even if you talk to them on the phone, that they can, and I agree with that, Zemeira, that clients can really pick up on who you are as a person. Even if they can't see you, they can tell by tone and what you say and how you present yourself. That tells them a lot, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So what are some of the challenges in doing this kind of work? What have you found that is most challenging to you in using the narrative therapy approach, Zemeira?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
I mean, I think in general, when folks have experienced a lot of difficulties in their lives, sometimes they can be wary, and sometimes the work can take a long time. You know, that like even though I work from a model that says, you know, if a client comes in one day and says they're ready to be done with therapy, we're going to have a conversation about that, but I'm going to trust them, you know, rather than like saying like, oh, you haven't finished your process yet or something. That, you know, a lot of problems that people struggle with take a lot of time to get built up in the first place. So they take a lot of time to get, you know, deconstructed. And also, you know, because I worked in the nonprofit world as well, working with a lot of at-risk youth and families and stuff, I did find that for many, many people who are struggling with like really, really major like effects on their life, like unsafe neighborhoods and institutionalized racism and, you know, systemic poverty and those kinds of things, that therapy can be helpful in helping them function better, but it can't actually address the root of the problem. You know, if you have problems in your larger systems, like I worked in the schools and there were a lot of problems in the schools themselves that then created a lot of problems for clients. You know, like those were things I couldn't really address with narrative therapy. I could name them. We could talk about them. But I wouldn't be able to, you know, stem the effects of, say, living in like a really unsafe area through therapy, or a family being homeless, or that kind of thing.
So really, so one of the I guess a couple of challenges really is you need to be patient, because for some clients, it's just going to take them a lot longer to work through issues, you know, depending on what they've been through. So I guess that can take time. And also there are things that are just beyond your control as a therapist, and beyond the client's control for that matter. If you look at, if you really look at this more from a system standpoint, the broader context of what's going on, you know, you look at the person within the system. That's really what you should be doing anyway, you know, to really understand what's impacting this person. I mean, the person doesn't come in, you know, they have depression, but there's a reason for that. And so what's the context of all this stuff? And that's what I hear you saying, that it's important to understand, but yet it's, you know, what kind of control do you have over that really?
Yeah, totally. It's very important. I mean, I also find, just in terms of working with different types of clients, but for people who are struggling with like more severe mental health stuff, you know, like something like bipolar disorder, or, you know, something, you know, schizophrenia, or like different things that like really affect like brain function, that they need more support than just an individual therapist can give. And I think that's, you know, just an important thing for people in graduate programs who might be listening to this to think about, you know, or that when I was working for an agency, I could do a lot more for, you know, somebody who maybe had a more serious mental health issue, because I had more resources and support, and there's like more people around. But me as an individual therapist, you know, if somebody is really struggling, I don't have the wherewithal to like really address those kinds of things,
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Mm-hmm.
in an hour or two a week.
Right.
And I think there's kind of a trend in our field to like put that responsibility on, you know, individual therapists,
Mm-hmm.
which like actually you just need more people, like with anything, you know, if you're going to build a house,
That's right.
you wouldn't just, it'd take you a lot longer to build a house if it was just you and there was no one to hold the posts,
Sure.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Than if you have a team. So, you know,
Yeah,
I think that's important.
And I
too.
think that even from how you've been talking about this approach, that if you were really into yourself and big ego and you know, thinking that I can do all of this, that's one thing. But from this narrative therapy approach, it's the exact opposite. And so you wouldn't expect that you can do all this by yourself as a therapist, and that you would rely on people in the community, people that you could refer to, you know, to go to advocate for your client and to set them up with resources and to work more as a team, I guess, as opposed to thinking that you can do it or should do it all yourself.
Yeah. And I think for the future of mental health in general, I think we do need more models like that, not just for the folks who are really, you know, like really, really struggling, but like in general, you know.
Oh, yeah.
We get better the more social support we have.
And couldn't agree more. Yep.
You know, more we have others to lean on.
Well, this last part of the interview, Zemeira, is what I call make a mental note. And I like to ask my guests about any tips or words of wisdom that they can offer to the audience about ways of just improving their mental wellness or their relationships. And I wonder if you have any tips that you could share with the mental note takers.
Mm-hmm. So I think the one thing I would say that's really important is for everyone to learn how to be your own best friend.
Say a little bit more about that.
Well, so what I find more often than not when talking with anybody who's having some sort of, you know, emotional challenge or that any difficulty in their relationship, is there's some part of them that really kind of isn't for their well-being, even if it's just in a subtle way. You know, there's some little, you know, we all have that inner critical voice, right? And that it's really an art to figure out how to recognize that voice, how to make sure that like it doesn't, you know, kind of get to be in charge of things, and how to really be kind to oneself. You know, I think Americans in particular, we have a really hard time with this. You know, we kind of, we have a lot of like self-attack. You know, oh, I shouldn't have eaten that piece of cake, or you know, I should have stayed an hour later at work, or you know, I should have been nicer. You know, and that inner voice can really be destructive for people in, you know, subtle ways and in really obvious ways. So that, I mean, that's what I would say, you know, figuring that out, whether it's through therapy, I mean, I think that's one thing therapy does, right?
Yep.
Is creates a real space of friendship, you know, kind of going back to Carl Rogers, that sort of thing, that then somebody can do that for themselves. So I think that's really important.
Your recommendation is similar to what you were talking about in the podcast interview, Zemeira, with the inner critic. I was thinking, well, is this another one of those entities that you're trying to make separate from the person? And it's almost like, would you recommend that they even put a name to the inner critic as a way to separate themselves from it? And it's almost like you're suggesting using that same approach.
Yeah, absolutely. Noticing it.
Yeah.
The other thing I would say, and we didn't talk about this much, but I am a very strong advocate of mindfulness meditation.
Uh-huh.
And I think that if just for general well-being, right, that if everybody could meditate 15 minutes a day, we'd have a very different world and people would be a lot happier.
Yes, isn't that the truth?
Yeah.
Well, if a client wants to get a hold of you, Zemeira, to set up an appointment, how could they get a hold of you?
The best way to reach me is through my website, which is new-narratives, narratives.com.
Okay.
And I'll give my phone number too, which is 510-463-4809.
Wonderful. Well, we'll put that in the show notes, so if anybody wants to get a hold of you, they can. And I really appreciate you coming on the podcast today to talk about narrative therapy. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure the listeners have too. So thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I appreciate Zemeira coming on the Make a Mental Note podcast today and talking about narrative therapy. And here's my mental notes takeaway. Our life stories can take on many different meanings. And how we choose to interpret those stories will define who we are and influence our stories moving on. Now, here's my question for you today. What is meant by externalizing the problem? Well, Zemeira talked about how narrative therapists, in some cases, try to help clients make the problem separate from themselves. So in the case of depression, talking about depression as if it's a third entity in the therapy room and not a part of the client, him or herself. And that by doing this, it empowers the client and it no longer defines who the client is as a person. And so it allows them to take on a new perspective and even write a new story for themselves if they so choose. So I think that that's a very important element that is part of this approach. Okay, if you would like to subscribe to the Make a Mental Note podcast series, you can do that easily by using the Downcast app and just subscribing to the series. And if you want the show notes for today's episode or any of the past episodes, you can go on to my website, chrisquarto.com, and very easy to get those. I really appreciate you tuning in every week to this podcast series. Make sure you tell your friends about it. Get them to listen to this. There's a lot of great episodes out there to listen to. Have a great rest of the week.